The laugh lasted 3 seconds. Not a nervous laugh. Not the kind people use to soften bad news they don't know how to hold. A real laugh. Bright. Quick. Sharpened at the edges. My wife leaned back against the marble kitchen island in our house on Lorraine Avenue in Highland Park, lifted her wine glass, and laughed when I told her I'd been fired. There were still 2 guests in the room when she did it. That's the part that mattered. Because private cruelty hurts one way. Public amusement hurts another. It was 8:17 p.m. on a Thursday in October. 41 minutes earlier, I'd been the chief revenue officer of a cyber risk company called Sentinel Crest, headquartered on the 26th floor of a glass building in uptown Dallas, with a base salary of $680,000, deferred equity that mattered, and a parking spot with my name etched on brushed steel. By 8:17, I was standing in my own kitchen holding a severance envelope while my wife smiled over the rim of a Bordeaux glass like she'd just been handed a punchline she felt entitled to enjoy. 8 months later, I used a key card with unrestricted executive access to enter the 44th floor of a different tower 3 miles away, walked past a new reception desk wrapped in white oak, and stepped into my wife's new office as the man signing her performance reviews. But that story only makes sense if I tell you exactly what kind of laugh it was, exactly what kind of man I was before it happened, and exactly how a person can mistake stability for weakness until the day stability becomes the thing that outranks them. My name is Grant Mercer. I'm 43 years old. I grew up in a 2-bedroom ranch house outside Dayton, Ohio, where my father repaired industrial compressors and my mother ran scheduling for a dental practice that always seemed one insurance delay away from not making payroll. I run companies for a living. Not in the glamorous way people imagine when they hear words like boardroom and acquisition and strategy, but in the practical way that means I walk into messy systems, bad cultures, inflated forecasts, exhausted managers, and product lines no one has looked at honestly in years, and I make them tell the truth. That skill has made me a lot of money. It has also made certain people deeply uncomfortable. Before I tell you why Vanessa laughed, and why the sound of it stayed with me longer than the firing itself, do me one favor: if you've ever been underestimated because you stayed calm when someone expected you to break, stay with me. This one earns its ending. I wasn't born into rooms with glass walls and catered lunches. I learned those rooms the same way I learned everything else that mattered, late, carefully, and with enough attention that by the time I spoke, the people who'd grown up there assumed I had too. My father, Martin Mercer, believed in maintenance the way some people believe in religion. Oil changed early. Bills paid before due dates. Handshakes kept. Tools returned to the drawer you took them from. He had large hands, permanently scored at the knuckles from 30 years of metal edges and pressure valves, and a habit of standing silently in a doorway when he wanted you to think your way into the right answer without him doing the work for you. My mother, Elaine, was softer in voice and harder in stamina. She could stretch one roast into 3 dinners, remember every prescription pickup for my grandmother, and still ask me whether I'd sent the follow-up email after a scholarship interview. Nothing dramatic happened in my childhood. No spectacular collapse. No inheritance. No miracle break. Just repetition, discipline, and the understanding that nobody was coming to make things easier because they liked your potential. I got into Purdue on an academic scholarship, majored in industrial engineering, and spent the first half of my 20s doing the least glamorous kind of useful work there is: process cleanup, warehousing, forecasting, systems migration, software adoption after bad acquisitions. The kind of work executives love to praise in quarterly town halls and almost never want to sit close enough to understand. It suited me. At 29, I joined a mid-market software company in Plano as a sales operations director. At 32, I was running national revenue operations. At 36, after a turnaround that took 14 ugly months and one CEO resignation to finish, I got a call from a recruiter who represented Sentinel Crest. Sentinel Crest sold cyber risk monitoring and compliance infrastructure to hospitals, regional banks, manufacturers, and public utilities, the kind of businesses that don't make the news until a breach turns them into a cautionary tale. The company had strong technology, a bloated go-to-market structure, and 3 consecutive quarters of promises nobody inside the building actually believed. That was where I came in. When I joined, annual recurring revenue was sitting at $118 million. Customer retention was slipping. Sales compensation had become a folklore system no 2 managers explained the same way. Implementation teams were burning out. Forecast calls had turned into theater. By the end of my second year, we were at $191 million in ARR, net retention had improved by 11 points, and half the people who'd privately told recruiters they were leaving had decided to stay. I wasn't the face of the company. I was the reason the numbers stopped lying. That distinction matters. Because people like clean stories. Visionary founder. Charismatic CEO. Genius product designer. They rarely understand the operator in the background whose job is to drag ambition through reality without killing either one. I was very good at that job, and the people who mattered knew it even when the press releases never used my name first. I met Vanessa at the French Room bar in the Adolphus Hotel 7 years before the firing. She was 30. I was 36. She worked in brand partnerships for a luxury residential developer whose projects always came with candles at launch events and adjectives like curated, elevated, and bespoke. She had dark hair she wore tucked behind one ear when she was listening closely, a fast smile, and the kind of social fluency that made every waiter think she was important within 90 seconds. We met because the stool beside mine was the only empty one in the room and she asked if it was taken. I said no. She ordered a gin martini, corrected the bartender once on the vermouth ratio without sounding rude, and asked me what I did. Most people ask that question as a sorting mechanism. Vanessa asked it like she expected the answer to entertain her. I told her I fixed company problems no one wanted on camera. She laughed then too, but that laugh was different. Warmer. Curious. Interested. That sounds expensive, she said. Usually for someone else, I told her. We dated for 18 months before we got married. In the beginning, she loved my steadiness, or said she did. She liked that I didn't peacock in rooms full of men trying too hard. She liked that I could hear nonsense in a sentence before the person saying it had finished dressing it up. She liked that I always knew where we stood financially, that dinner reservations happened without fuss, that flights got booked early, that our mortgage on Lorraine Avenue never once felt precarious, that when the ice machine line burst 2 weeks before Christmas I had a plumber there in 40 minutes and the hardwood floors saved before lunch. Stability is intoxicating when someone else provides it. The problem comes when stability stops looking glamorous. Vanessa had grown up in University Park with a father who sold commercial insurance and a mother who chaired benefit luncheons as if they were a branch of public office. Her family wasn't old money, but they had mastered the posture of people who want to be mistaken for it. Her mother, Celeste Harrow, used words like standards when she meant class markers and asked questions about schools, zip codes, and club memberships with the kind of smile that tried to make curiosity look gracious. At first, Celeste liked me because I was a safe bet. Then I made the mistake of not needing her approval. It wasn't overt in the early years. It almost never is with people who have spent their whole lives practicing social deniability. It was little things. Asking whether my parents were still in Ohio, in the tone people use for an old storage unit they'd forgotten to close out. Wondering aloud whether my work schedule made it difficult for Vanessa to maintain a proper social rhythm. Telling a table full of people at a Christmas brunch that I had a solid face for operations, as though that were a compliment and not a classification. Vanessa would squeeze my knee under the table when her mother did things like that. Later, in the car, she'd apologize. Then she'd ask me not to make it a thing. And because I loved her, and because nothing is easier to excuse than a pattern that hasn't yet cost you enough, I let a lot of those moments pass by unnamed. If I sound clinical talking about my marriage, understand this, I did love my wife. Fully. Generously. There is nothing restrained about how I supported her when support was called for. When she wanted to leave residential development and move into strategic brand consulting, I backed the transition. When she spent 14 months contracting independently and had uneven income, I covered more than my share without ever itemizing it. When she decided she eventually wanted an executive role instead of agency work and talked about needing a different kind of company behind her, I introduced her to people in my network, reviewed her compensation asks, rewrote her positioning deck, and sat with her at our dining table while she practiced answers to board-facing interview questions she'd never had to field before. I didn't just love Vanessa. I fortified her. And for a while, she seemed to understand the value of that. Then Sentinel Crest grew. Then the money grew. Then the title became part of how she introduced herself to the world. That was the beginning of the distortion. The first 5 years of our marriage were, from the outside, enviable in the most conventional way. We had a good address. We traveled well. We knew which restaurants could still find you a table at 8:30 if you called the right person. We hosted dinners with linen napkins and low lighting and playlists Vanessa built as if she were staging a version of our life she wanted the room to believe. I don't say that bitterly. Not yet. Some of those nights were genuinely lovely. I remember a spring dinner on our back patio 2 years in, before things curdled. The jasmine along the fence had just started to catch, the halibut came out right on time, and Vanessa looked at me across 6 guests and smiled with the private ease of someone who still liked the person she was married to when no one else was talking. We were not always broken. I want to be fair enough to say that. But ambition, unmanaged, has a way of eating fairness from the edges. Vanessa's consulting work gained traction. She rebranded herself twice in 18 months, which should have told me something. First she was a brand storyteller. Then an audience architect. Then an executive narrative strategist, which is the sort of title that can mean nearly anything if the invoice is designed well enough. She was talented, truly. Quick read on people. Strong taste. Excellent in rooms where confidence did more work than content. What she lacked was patience with slow authority. I have slow authority. I don't dominate rooms early. I don't need immediate attention to feel secure. I tend to listen longer than charismatic people find comfortable, and by the time I speak I've usually already understood which sentence matters and which ones are decoration. That style works exceptionally well in operations, negotiations, and board politics. It does not photograph particularly well. Vanessa, increasingly, cared about what photographed well. The shift was incremental enough that at first I mistook it for harmless polish. She started asking sharper questions about title hierarchy, who technically outranked whom, which CEOs were merely figureheads, which executives actually had equity, how much deferred compensation mattered compared to cash, how board visibility translated into power. None of that is inherently suspect. Smart spouses ask about the architecture of the lives they share. But eventually I noticed that she wasn't asking to understand me. She was asking to measure me. And then, once measurement enters a marriage, comparison follows like mold and drywall. It began with tiny corrections. A dinner with friends where she referred to me not as the person running revenue, systems alignment, and market execution at Sentinel Crest, but as, kind of the infrastructure side, of the business, which was inaccurate in a way subtle enough to be deniable and pointed enough that I felt it anyway. Another evening where a venture-backed founder was talking too loudly about his recent valuation and Vanessa said on the drive home, at least he knows how to own a room. He also loses 40 cents on every dollar of revenue, I told her. That isn't what people remember, she said. That sentence sat with me. Not because it was devastating. Because it was instructive. There are people who care about truth, and people who care about what the room remembers. Vanessa had begun drifting decisively toward the second category. Her mother encouraged it, of course. Celeste had a remarkable ability to turn aspiration into moral language. If Vanessa wanted a more visible role, Celeste called that standards. If Vanessa became restless with the practical mechanics of how money was actually earned, Celeste called that refusing to settle. If Vanessa expressed frustration that I wasn't more publicly flashy despite making more than enough to afford flash, Celeste called that having a sense of image. My father, by contrast, heard one story about Celeste's commentary over a Thanksgiving bourbon and said, "She sounds like the kind of person who confuses price with value because one is easier to recognize from the parking lot." My father has never once been impressed by external polish. Neither, usually, have I. Which is why I missed how much Vanessa was learning to resent it. The year before I was fired, Sentinel Crest entered what public companies and private equity-backed companies alike always call a strategic growth phase when they mean a period during which unreasonable promises get made under fluorescent lighting by people who do not intend to personally absorb the consequences. We'd taken a minority investment from Ashcroft Ridge Partners, a growth equity firm out of New York with excellent tailoring. Aggressive reporting expectations, and 2 board appointees who asked polished questions designed to make caution sound like weakness. Our CEO, Derek Linwood, had built the company from a 3-person security consulting outfit into a real software platform. He was smart, energetic, and gradually becoming too fond of his own mythology. We began pushing harder into enterprise accounts we were not yet operationally ready to support. Forecast language got more elastic. Implementation constraints were reframed as temporary friction. Deals that would once have been marked as possible started appearing in pipeline reviews as probable because someone needed a quarter to look cleaner than reality justified. I fought that drift every week. Not loudly. Not theatrically. I simply kept refusing to sign off on numbers I knew were dressed up for daylight. That made me useful to the board when truth was needed and irritating to certain people whenever truth threatened timing. I can live with being irritating. What I didn't understand in real time was that irritation, in corporate life, becomes vulnerability the moment someone decides your competence is no longer as politically valuable as your compliance would be. Vanessa knew some of this. Not all. I don't bring confidential board issues into the kitchen. But she knew enough to sense strain. She could tell when I came home carrying the kind of silence that meant 3 separate people had tried to convince me a red number was conceptually green if you looked at it through investor messaging. At first, she played confidant. Then she began sounding like a consultant hired by my critics. "Maybe you're too rigid," she told me one night in bed while scrolling through her phone. About reporting integrity? About how people feel working with you when you won't bend. "I don't need them to feel hugged by the forecast," I said. "I need the forecast to stop lying." She sighed the sigh of someone tired of an argument I hadn't realized I'd officially entered. "This is why founders outmaneuver operators sometimes," she said. "People follow certainty, not correction." I turned off my bedside lamp after that and lay awake longer than I needed to, not because I thought she was entirely wrong, but because there was admiration in her voice for the wrong side of the equation. That winter, Vanessa started spending more time with a woman named Betrayal Townsend, a former luxury PR executive who had reinvented herself as an executive presence advisor for female leaders. Betrayal believed in aura management, visual alignment, and treating every corporate interaction as a stage composition. She once looked at my navy suit at a holiday fundraiser and told Vanessa, while standing close enough that I could hear, that some men earn too much money to keep dressing like they still want to be trusted. Vanessa laughed at that. Softly. But she laughed. You need to understand that betrayal rarely arrives with horns and theater. Most of the time it announces itself in tiny permissions. The joke your spouse doesn't shut down. The revision of your role in a room. The subtle embarrassment that enters their posture when you respond to nonsense with substance instead of performance. By the time the spring conference circuit started, Vanessa had become fascinated with founders half my age who threw around language like category creation, personal brand scale, and narrative-led market capture. Most of them burned cash like fireworks and treated discipline as something smaller people used because they lacked imagination. She found them electric. I found them expensive. Around the same time, Sentinel Crest began exploring a possible merger path with Northaven Dynamics, a fast-growing risk intelligence competitor based out of a 38-story tower off McKinney Avenue. Northaven had aggressive branding, sleek offices, and exactly the kind of executive leadership optics Vanessa admired. The company was led by a CEO named Ryland Frost, who smiled like he outsourced conscience and seemed to believe sunglasses indoors communicated inevitability. Ryland and I disliked each other immediately. Not openly. Professionally. But immediately. He spoke in abstractions. I spoke in operating realities. He sold speed. I asked what broke when speed outpaced implementation. He treated every concern as a temporary narrative obstacle. I treated every unaddressed systems issue as a future headline. Vanessa met him once at a fundraising event for the Dallas Children's Research Alliance. On the drive home she said, "You have to admit, people like him go farther in public." Public isn't the same thing as far, I told her. She looked out the passenger side window after that and said nothing. I should have paid closer attention to the silence. Because the week before I was fired, Vanessa asked an oddly specific question over breakfast. If you ever left Sentinel Crest, would you still be bound by the non-solicit on the enterprise accounts? I looked up from my coffee. Why? Just curious. Curious questions usually have a destination. Not everything is strategy, Grant. That is a sentence people often use right before you discover it was, in fact, strategy. The Monday I lost my job started with a 7 a.m. board prep call, a forecast dispute, and an email from Derek marked urgent that contained no useful information and too much fake warmth. By noon, I knew something had shifted. By 4:30, I knew the shape of it. By 7:36 p.m., I had a severance packet in my briefcase, my company laptop surrendered, and a future I had not consented to sitting in the passenger seat beside me on the drive home. And my wife was setting out stemware for guests. The meeting happened in Conference 26B, which at Sentinel Crest was one of those glass-walled rooms given a reassuring name by people who believed naming things Aspen or Horizon made bad conversations feel curated. Inside were Derek, our head of legal, and one board representative from Ashcroft Ridge named Miles Avery, a man who always managed to sit like furniture had been designed around his sense of entitlement. There was water on the table. There are always little dignities present at professional executions. Water. A packet. A face arranged into regret. Derek did the first 3 minutes himself. He spoke about strategic alignment, leadership evolution, a changing market environment, and the need for a different profile in the next phase of growth. People always reach for abstraction when the concrete truth would expose them too clearly. So I did him the favor he was too polished to do for himself. You're asking me to leave because I won't certify a fantasy pipeline before the secondary raise, I said. Miles folded his hands. We're saying, he replied, that the company needs an executive team calibrated to the pace of the opportunity in front of us. No, I said. You're saying I'm expensive, inconvenient, and difficult to publicly narrate around because I keep attaching evidence to optimism. Legal stared at her notes. Derek tried one last smile. Grant, let's not make this adversarial. I have always found that sentence clarifying. It usually means the other person would prefer you accept consequences quietly because the argument becomes less comfortable if everyone uses accurate nouns. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten litigation. I didn't perform injured dignity for the room. I asked about equity acceleration, restrictive covenants, severance continuation, health coverage, and whether my unvested performance tranche would be converted or extinguished in the event of a capital event within the next 2 quarters. That was the moment Miles stopped treating me like the emotional party in the room. Because competence remains competence even while being removed from a building. I negotiated in that room for 32 minutes. My severance moved from 6 months to 9. My outstanding restricted units received a partial acceleration clause in the event of a financing or merger within 180 days. The non-disparagement language became mutual. The non-solicit was narrowed. And I kept the consulting retainer option they had hoped I would waive because they still knew, under all the politics, that half the systems they planned to brag about in future decks had my fingerprints all over them. When I stood to leave, Derek said, I hope you know this isn't personal. Of course it is, I told him. It's just also financial. Then I walked out. I did not expect grief in the parking garage. That surprised me. The anger I anticipated. The insult, yes. Even a form of relief, if I'm honest, because spending a year in a system that rewards theatrical conviction over responsible truth will erode anyone eventually. But grief hit me halfway through level P3 when I realized my access card wouldn't work tomorrow and a decade of competence had just been turned into a narrative inconvenience by men who would privately use my spreadsheets for another 18 months. I sat in my car for 6 minutes before turning the ignition. Then I drove home. Vanessa had invited another couple over that night, Noah and Elise Barton, social friends of hers whose primary skills seemed to be expensive workouts and aggressively casual mentions of Aspen. I'd forgotten they were coming until I saw Noah's Mercedes in the driveway. I considered circling the block. Then I thought, no. Whatever this night is, let it be what it is. When I walked in, Vanessa was in the kitchen in a cream silk blouse I recognized from a brand she liked precisely because most people couldn't immediately recognize it unless they spent too much time around labels. Elise was near the stove talking about a charity auction. Noah was opening a bottle of red he had brought because people like Noah enjoy bringing wine to houses where the cellar is better than theirs. Vanessa looked up and smiled automatically. Then she registered my face. "You're early," she said. "They made the decision this afternoon," I told her. I set my briefcase down by the butler's pantry and pulled the severance envelope out with a kind of detached curiosity. As if showing her the packet might make the fact of it less absurd. I got fired. There are a lot of ways a loving spouse can receive that sentence. Concern. Shock. Protective anger on your behalf. Questions. What my wife did instead was glance once at the envelope, then at Noah and Elise, then back at me, and laugh. 3 seconds. Not huge. Not hysterical. Worse than that. Controlled enough that she thought she might still be able to call it a reaction instead of a revelation. Elisa's eyebrows lifted. Noah looked suddenly interested in the cork. "I'm sorry," Vanessa said, still smiling in the remains of the laugh. Grant, I did not think they'd actually do it." That's what she said first. Not "Are you okay?" Not "What happened?" Not "Come here." I stood there and felt something inside me move 1 inch to the left. If you've ever had a relationship end before the logistics catch up to it, you know that feeling. Not a collapse. A realignment. The moment the structure is still standing but your internal map of the load-bearing walls changes permanently. "They did it," I said. Noah muttered something about giving us a minute. Vanessa waved him off. "No, it's fine," she said, then turned to me. "Was this about the board issues you kept talking about?" Kept talking about. As though I had been a man with a hobby horse instead of the executive trying to stop a company from flattering itself into a regulatory problem. "In part," I said. She set her glass down and crossed her arms. "Okay. Well. Maybe this isn't the worst thing. There are sentences that are imperfectly phrased. And there are sentences that expose the speaker more than the moment they are trying to manage. This was the second kind. Not the worst thing," I repeated. "Grant, come on. You've been miserable for months. And if I'm being honest," she stopped there, which told me she had already crossed some line in her head and was deciding whether to keep going in front of witnesses. "If you're being honest, what?" Vanessa looked at me with a steadiness that would have impressed me in a negotiation. "Maybe now you'll have to figure out who you are without the title carrying half the room for you." Elise looked down. Noah stepped farther toward the patio doors. I remember every detail after that with unusual precision. The hum of the Sub-Zero compressor. The scent of rosemary from the lamb she had been finishing. The tiny red reflection of the pendant lights caught in the bowl of her wine glass. Trauma is too dramatic a word for what happened in that kitchen. But humiliation has excellent memory. You think my title was carrying me, I said. I think you hide behind competence, she replied. That's an interesting criticism to make of the person who paid this mortgage on schedule every month. Her jaw tightened. There it is, she said. You always do that. You turn everything into an invoice without actually saying invoice. I have never once held money over your head. You don't have to, she said. The structure does it for you. That was when I understood this conversation had not started tonight. Not for her. She had been rehearsing versions of it for months. The firing was simply the first occasion convenient enough to deliver it. Would you prefer they had fired me after dessert? I asked. She laughed again. Smaller this time. Sharper. I would prefer, she said, that you stop acting like being indispensable at work makes you impossible to fail anywhere else. Now, there are two ways a man can respond in that moment. He can fight for emotional dominance in the room. Or he can start listening for information. I chose the second. Because beneath Vanessa's cruelty there was something else that interested me more, relief. She did not sound frightened for us. She sounded released from a burden she'd been waiting to set down. That matters. When people reveal relief at your vulnerability, it means the private story they've been telling about you already required your reduction. Noah finally said, very quietly, maybe we should go. You should, I told him. Elise squeezed Vanessa's forearm on the way out. Not because she approved. Because women like Elise have spent years learning how to physically touch the nearest person when a room goes morally sideways and they don't know what language to offer. The front door shut. The kitchen got larger. Vanessa exhaled like a person finally reaching the real meeting after the junior attendees had cleared the conference room. I'm not apologizing for reacting honestly, she said. Then don't. She looked at me, annoyed now that I wasn't escalating on cue. Do you want to know what I think? She asked. I suspect you're going to tell me. I think you built an identity around being the adult in every room. The fixer. The one nobody can surprise. And maybe this is the first thing that's happened to you in years that you can't process like a systems problem. She took a sip of wine. Maybe that's useful. Useful. That was the word. Not painful. Not destabilizing. Useful. The laugh had been one thing. The philosophy behind it was another. I didn't answer for several seconds. Then I asked the only question that suddenly felt worth asking. Are you still my wife because you love me, or because my life has been convenient to stand next to? For the first time that night, she looked uncertain. Not guilty. Not shattered. Uncertain. And if you have enough experience negotiating with people, you know uncertainty is often more informative than denial. That's not fair, she said. It's precise. She set her glass down harder than necessary. You want precision? Fine. I am tired, Grant. Tired of the house being managed like an operations dashboard. Tired of every conversation becoming a lesson in what is real versus what is performative. Tired of feeling like your version of seriousness is the only respectable one. You think everyone else is shallow because they understand appearances matter. They do matter. They matter in careers, in rooms, in marriages. She folded her arms again. And honestly, maybe this job loss is the first honest thing that's happened to us in a while. That sentence should have devastated me. Instead, it calmed me. Because it gave the problem edges. She did not think my job loss was a tragedy we were facing together. She thought it was evidence supporting a case she had already built. Okay, I said. One word. Nothing else. And that one word frightened her more than any anger would have. I saw it happen in her face. The slight recalibration. She had prepared for objection. For wounded pride. For a measurable argument she could win or at least narrate herself through. She had not prepared for me to stop contesting the premise and start accepting the information. "What does okay mean?" she asked. "It means I heard you. That's all. For tonight, yes." I picked up the severance envelope, walked to my study, closed the door, and called 3 people before 10 p.m. The first was my attorney. The second was a former board chair who owed me 2 returned favors and 1 unasked one. The third was my father. He answered on the second ring. "Something broke," he said before I had even said hello. "Parents who know you well can hear weather inside your breathing." I told him what happened. Not dramatically. Just the facts. "Fired. Severance." Vanessa laughed. He let the silence sit for a few seconds. Then he asked, "Was it nerves?" "No." "Was it mean?" "Yes." Another pause. Then he said, "All right. Then now you know what was already true before tonight. What do I do with that?" I asked. "You don't react to it," he said. "You use it." He didn't mean use the pain. He meant use the clarity. And there is a difference. At 11:12, Vanessa knocked once on the study door. I didn't tell her to come in. She opened it anyway. "Are you really not going to talk?" she asked. "Not usefully tonight. You are unbelievable when you do this calm thing." "This calm thing," I said, "is the only reason there is a house around us to argue inside." Her face hardened at that. There it was again. The irritation not just with me, but with the fact that reality had a ledger and I was willing to name where the entries came from. "I think you should stay somewhere else for a few days," she said. I looked at her. "You think I should leave my own house because you laughed when I got fired?" "I think space would help." "Space helps people who want repair," I told her. "I'm not convinced that's what you want." She didn't answer. Which was answer enough. I did leave the house, but not because Vanessa asked. I left the following afternoon after a 12-minute conversation with my attorney, a 43-minute review of our jointly titled accounts, and one look at Vanessa in the breakfast room taking a call from Betrayal Townsend with the low, tense voice people use when they're trying to sound in control for an audience of one. I packed a week of clothes, my watches, the leather folio that held every meaningful contract note I still kept in hard copy, and the framed photo of my parents in front of their paid-off house in Kettering. I did not take anything from the walls. I did not dramatize my exit. No slammed drawers. No speech in the hallway. Just a garment bag, a duffel, and the understanding that if a home can turn into a set that quickly, you should not mistake furniture for sanctuary. I checked into a long-stay suite at the Crescent Court. Then I got to work. People who haven't been through a personal collapse tend to imagine recovery as emotional first and tactical later. In my experience, the order is often reversed. You handle immediate structure because structure keeps you from drowning in interpretation. Within 72 hours, I'd done the following. Reviewed the severance agreement line by line with Amelia Sloan, my counsel. Moved my personal liquidity into separate accounts and documented every shared obligation with clean dates and supporting records. Created a written chronology of the board disputes that preceded my termination in the event Sentinel Crest attempted reputational games later. Reached out discreetly to 7 industry contacts, not to beg for work, but to reopen active market awareness. Had a locksmith change the storage cage code at our off-site unit where some of my inherited items were kept. Transferred my personal notes, private models, and non-company templates into encrypted storage. Booked one session with a therapist recommended by Amelia because she is the sort of attorney who understands legal separation is still a human event even when both parties are financially literate. That last one mattered more than I admitted at the time. Because while my outer life was reorganizing cleanly, internally I was carrying 2 insults at once, the firing, which attacked my professional identity, and Vanessa's laugh, which attacked the dignity of having believed myself loved without condition. Sentinel Crest announced my departure on a Friday at 5:42 p.m., the traditional burial hour for news companies hope won't trigger too much attention. The internal note praised my contributions, cited strategic evolution, and included exactly 3 sentences of false graciousness signed by Derek. My phone lit up for 2 days anyway. Former colleagues. Competitors. Recruiters. One board member from a previous company who sent only a text that said, "If you were removed this suddenly, the story inside is worse than the story outside." Coffee next week? Yes, I thought. It usually is. Vanessa and I began mediation discussions the second week after I left the house. To call them discussions flatters the emotional content involved. They were clean, controlled, and revealing. Vanessa wanted the house sold. She wanted to preserve appearances through a joint statement if social circles asked. She wanted, very specifically, no language suggesting marital misconduct. That last request interested me. There had been no affair I could prove. Not then. But when people hurry to manage narrative exposure before you've accused them of anything, it tells you they're already braced against the possibility that facts and impression might not align in their favor. I signed nothing quickly. I never do. In the 3rd week after the firing, I had lunch at Nick Sam's with a man named Conrad Bell. Conrad is 61, silver-haired in the manner of men who look more trustworthy after private aviation, and was once the executive chairman of a manufacturing software company I'd helped salvage during a brutal post-acquisition integration. He had liked 2 things about me back then, that I could speak plainly in boardrooms full of vanity, and that I never asked to be rescued when a hard quarter made a headline feel possible. He ordered iced tea. I ordered black coffee. He listened to the Sentinel Crest story without interrupting once. Then he asked, "How angry are you, really?" Not because he wanted gossip. Because anger affects judgment, and men like Conrad do not place damaged executives into new roles until they understand whether the damage is combustible or refining. Enough to be clear, I told him. Not enough to be sloppy. He nodded. Good. Because Ashford Vale is looking for an operator. Ashford Vale Capital was a lower middle market private equity firm with a Dallas office, a Chicago office, and a habit of buying promising B2B software businesses that had outgrown founder mythology but not yet earned adult governance. They didn't need a celebrity CEO. They needed someone who could walk into companies built on adrenaline and make them survivable. In other words, they needed someone like me. The role Conrad had in mind wasn't immediate CEO placement. It was operating partner with a path, evaluate targets, support portfolio interventions, lead diligence where commercial optimism was outrunning reality, and, if the right asset appeared, step in full-time. The compensation package was materially lower in guaranteed cash than Sentinel Crest had paid. It was meaningfully better in carried upside. More important, it offered leverage instead of dependence. I met Ashford Vale's managing partner, Miriam Klein, on a Tuesday morning in a conference room on Ross Avenue with floor-to-ceiling windows and precisely the kind of intentional quiet rich firms spend money manufacturing. Miriam was 50, dry-eyed, brilliant, and had the face of a woman who had never once mistaken charm for diligence. She asked me 16 questions in 70 minutes. 3 were about operating systems. 5 were about pattern recognition in founder-led dysfunction. 2 were about my tolerance for public ambiguity. 1 was about how I had handled being fired. I told the truth. Professionally first, I said. Emotionally later. She wrote something down. And personally. I looked at her for a second. My wife laughed when I told her. Miriam's pen stopped. Not out of pity. Out of calibration. Then she asked, very quietly, "And what did that teach you?" That anyone who greets your destabilization with relief was already benefiting from a version of you they didn't respect. She closed the folder. When can you start? I joined Ashford Vale on December 1st. By Christmas, I had reviewed 8 potential acquisitions. By late January, I had killed 3 because the customer concentration risk was disguised as momentum. By February, I was leading diligence on a cybersecurity training and compliance platform in Phoenix whose churn math had been cosmetically improved by discounts nobody intended to sustain. And by March, I had rediscovered something I hadn't fully felt in the final year at Sentinel Crest. Enjoyment. Not joy exactly. That would have been too complete a word for where I was then. But enjoyment, yes. The clean satisfaction of competence applied where it is wanted instead of politically tolerated. Meanwhile, my marriage finished becoming paperwork. Vanessa moved into a lease at the Victor in Victory Park after I declined to contest her short-term occupancy request and then agreed, through counsel, to the sale process for Lorraine Avenue. We divided assets in a manner any outside observer would call civilized. No screaming over silverware. No performative court filings. We were too educated and too image-aware for that. But civility and tenderness are not synonyms. She texted me twice outside legal channels in those months. The first time was in January after her mother had apparently told a lunch table that I had become difficult toward the end of the marriage. Vanessa sent, "She shouldn't have said that." "I'm sorry." I replied, "Noted." The second was in March. "I heard you're with Ashford Vale. That's a smart move." No apology. No warmth. Just positioning. I looked at the message for a moment, then deleted it. Because by then I had started understanding a truth I wish more people learned earlier: when someone's respect for you tracks your visible relevance, do not mistake renewed professionalism for remorse. Often it's just market adjustment. Around that same time, I began hearing North Haven dynamics mentioned more often in Ashford Vale's internal pipeline discussions. At first, only in passing. Rapid top-line growth. Strong market narrative. Questionable customer economics under the polish. Founder CEO with strong external presence. Possible recap opportunity if governance pressure increased. I paid attention for reasons both professional and private. Professionally, North Haven was the kind of company I understand very well, impressive in pitch decks, somewhat less impressive in process maps. Privately, it was the company Vanessa had begun talking about a little too often before the end. Then, in April, I learned something else. Vanessa had accepted a senior vice president role there. She didn't tell me herself. I heard it from a mutual acquaintance at a museum board dinner who assumed I already knew and gave me the news with the over-careful brightness people use when they think they may have stepped on live emotional wiring. "She's heading partnerships and market positioning," he said. "Big jump for her. New office and everything." I thanked him for the information and asked whether the scallops were any good. Inside, something cold and focused settled into place. Not revenge. People are too lazy with that word. What settled into place was alignment. A market event and a personal event had begun moving toward the same address. The trick, from there, was not to force anything. The trick was to let reality keep walking until it arrived where it was already headed. Ashford Vale's interest in North Haven did not become serious all at once. That is not how serious money behaves. First came the whisper set, the early signals that a glossy growth story was carrying more internal strain than public materials implied. A missed CFO search. A senior implementation executive departure explained online as a transition into advisory work, even though people only take advisory titles that quickly when someone wants their biography to leave the building before lunch. A contract renewal dispute with a regional hospital network. A board observer note from someone in Miriam's network suggesting Ryland Frost had become narratively overextended, which is private equity language for a leader who has begun believing his own keynote slides at the expense of controllable operations. Then came data. North Haven's top line was real, but the quality underneath it was softer than the brand suggested. Too much revenue concentration in a narrow band of enterprise accounts. Too many implementation concessions buried inside letters. Too much reliance on charismatic selling to outrun customer success reality. Their customer acquisition cost looked attractive until you normalized for event spending, founder-led enterprise closing, and the fact that they were effectively subsidizing adoption to preserve their growth myth. I knew this pattern. High-gloss companies often borrow tomorrow's stability to pay for today's momentum. The bill always arrives. The only question is who is standing near the table when it does. Miriam asked me to lead deeper operating diligence in May. That meant building the case no one says out loud in the early meetings. If we buy this thing, what exactly are we buying besides a beautiful story and an expensive front desk? I spent 3 weeks in Northaven's data room, 3 more in management sessions. And half a dozen late nights reconstructing the business in a form that could survive honesty. The product was strong. The market was real. The leadership culture was ornamental. Those are not the same thing. Ryland Frost treated every diligence call like a magazine profile with spreadsheets attached. He wore open-collar cashmere in rooms where everyone else had laptops open. He answered questions about churn with framing language instead of cause analysis. He described founder intuition as if it were a sufficient substitute for repeatable process. He liked me less each week because I kept asking follow-up questions after the kind of sweeping answer he was used to treating as a finish line. At one point he said, smiling, "Grant, you think like an operator." "I am one," I said. "Right. I'm just saying you can miss what makes a company magnetic if you're over-indexed on control. And you can miss what makes it solvent if you aren't indexed enough." Miriam muted herself to hide a smile. Now, here's the part one want to tell carefully. Vanessa was not part of the acquisition thesis. She was not a lever, not a target, not some secret motive force in a board memo. I did not guide Ashford Vale toward Northaven because my ex-wife worked there. Anyone telling the story that way would be giving romance too much power over capital allocation. Northaven was attractive because the asset was real and the leadership structure had become vulnerable. Vanessa's role simply made the future more narratively efficient. That's all. Still, it would be dishonest to pretend I felt nothing the first time I saw her in one of the management session decks. Senior Vice President. Strategic Partnerships and Market Development. A professionally lit headshot. A bio polished within an inch of sincerity. My introductions rewritten from husbandly support into self-authored executive language. She had positioned herself well. Better than I would have expected 8 months earlier. That is another truth adults should get comfortable with: people can hurt you and still be talented. Your pain does not erase their competence. It simply changes what you owe them. The first live meeting we were in together happened on a Thursday in June in Northaven's temporary strategy suite, 3 floors below the newly built executive offices that weren't yet fully occupied. She entered 6 minutes after Rylan, carrying a leather folio and a steel bottle of water, and stopped for a fraction of a second when she saw me at the table. To her credit, the pause was brief. "Grant," she said. Not warm. Not rattled. Just surprised enough for the truth to show before the control returned. "Vanessa," I replied. Rylan, reading only part of the room, beamed like a man who thought coincidence was good theater. "You two know each other?" Vanessa answered before I did. "We were married," she said. There are moments when the air in a corporate room changes shape so subtly that only people trained by conflict notice it. That was one of them. The associates from Ashford Vale suddenly looked very interested in their notes. Northaven's CFO blinked once, hard. Ryland's smile stayed up half a beat too long while he searched for the correct emotional costume. "Well," he said finally, "Dallas really is a small market." It is not. But embarrassed people say odd things. I spared him. "We're both here to talk about the business," I said. "Let's do that." Vanessa sat across from me and did something that impressed me even as it unsettled me: she recovered fast. Faster than most people could have. She delivered her portion of the partnership's overview cleanly. Strong cadence. Good client anecdotes. A persuasive market map. Her weakness, as always, was that she understood narrative architecture better than operating proof. She could explain what an alliance meant aspirationally with beautiful language. She was less prepared when I asked what % of projected channel-influenced pipeline had converted to contracted revenue net of discounts and implementation delays. She answered carefully. Then looked at the CFO. That glance told me everything. She had title expansion without information sovereignty. That happens all the time in fast-growing companies. Someone is promoted into visibility before they're truly seated inside the engine room. They become an executive externally and a dependent internally. It looks powerful right up until hard questions arrive. After the meeting ended, Vanessa caught me near the elevators. Did Miriam know? She asked. About us? About us being in the same process. Yes. And she still put you on this deal? Miriam doesn't confuse personal history with professional incapacity. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. Of course she doesn't. Is there a reason she should have? Vanessa held my gaze a moment longer. I just didn't realize North Haven was on your side of the table now. It's a small market, I said. That was petty. Not catastrophic. Not career-defining. But petty, and precise, and I allowed myself exactly that much. She exhaled through her nose. You're enjoying this? No, I said. I'm working. The distinction bothered her because it was true. Over the next 6 weeks, the North Haven situation accelerated. A missed quarter became harder to narrate. 2 major customers pushed back on rollout commitments. The board grew concerned that Ryland's appetite for image had outpaced his appetite for governance. Ashford Vale moved from exploratory interest to structured engagement. There were nights when I left our office after midnight with 19 tabs open in my brain: customer cohort analysis, renewal cliffs, attrition probabilities, deferred implementation liabilities, compensation plan distortion, cultural fragility. I was too busy to indulge fantasy. That is why the eventual outcome mattered. It wasn't ordained. It was earned. Meanwhile, Vanessa's public image at North Haven grew faster than her actual internal footing. Her LinkedIn updates became more executive. Her photos shifted subtly toward stronger tailoring, darker neutrals, cleaner background lines. She began appearing beside Ryland at partner events, museum sponsorship dinners, and an absurdly expensive rooftop launch for their new market education initiative, which, from what I could tell, was mostly a lead generation machine disguised as thought leadership. I saw some of it because Dallas is an ecosystem built on accidental witness. More of it came to me through people who knew enough not to gossip directly and just enough not to resist implying things. One such implication came from Noah Barton, of all people. He called in early July under the pretext of wanting advice on a software investment his brother-in-law was considering. We met at Al Burnat's. He talked about the investment for 11 minutes. Then he set his fork down and said, "Elise thinks she should have told you sooner, but I didn't think it was my place." That sentence usually means it is exactly your place, I said. He winced. Vanessa's been telling people the Sentinel thing forced her to reassess what kind of life she wanted. And what kind was that? One with more momentum, I think was the word. He looked embarrassed for himself. She said she spent years standing next to responsible and mistook it for visionary. I cut into my steak and chewed before answering, because chewing is useful when you'd like to keep your face from saying anything unpaid for. Did she? Grant, I don't think she meant. Don't help her revise after the fact, I told him. Not harshly. Just enough. He nodded and did not try again. That night I called my father. Not because I needed rescue. Because I needed calibration. I told him what Noah had said. Dad listened, then asked, "Does hearing it change what the business is worth?" No. Does it change whether the people running it are doing it well? No. Then don't let a personal insult rent office space inside a financial decision. He was right. He usually is when the sentence is plain enough to embarrass you into discipline. So I went back to work. By mid-July, Ashford Vale had a path. Not a hostile grab. Not some cinematic raid. Something quieter and more realistic, a structured recapitalization supported by nervous board members, a founder liquidity event framed as strategic transition, and a leadership change packaged not as punishment but as institutional maturation. Ryland could exit with money and language flattering enough to protect his self-image. The board could tell itself it had chosen stewardship over chaos. Ashford Vale could buy the company beneath the mythology. And if the deal closed, North Haven would need an adult in the building on day one. Miriam called me at 9:18 p.m. the night the board softened. If this closes, she said, I want you in the seat. CEO. Full authority. Day one. She paused. Can you handle the personal wrinkle without contaminating the job? I knew what she meant. Vanessa. Yes, I said. I don't need quick certainty. I need true certainty. Then yes, I said again. Because if I couldn't, I'd tell you no. Silence. Then, good. Because I don't hire men who need an audience for their dignity. Neither, as it turns out, do I. The deal signed on a Sunday. Most meaningful transitions do. Weekdays belong to the stories companies tell about themselves in public. Sundays belong to the people who have to rearrange the furniture after the story changes. Final documents were executed just after 2 p.m. Ryland accepted a transition package, a board-approved press release, and enough cash to tell himself he had chosen this outcome rather than been professionally escorted into it. The board retained 2 seats. Ashford Vale took control. Miriam called me at 2:11. It's done, she said. I was in the small gym at the Crescent, halfway through a workout I hadn't been paying attention to. When do you want me there? Tomorrow. 7:30. Leadership brief first. All staff at 9. Department meetings after that. Understood. She waited a beat. How are you, really? It was the first time she'd asked me something close to human all the way through. Focused, I said. Good. Stay that way. I hung up and sat on the bench press for a few seconds longer than necessary. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because certain kinds of symmetry deserve to be acknowledged privately before you refuse to perform them for anyone else. 8 months earlier, I had stood in my kitchen while Vanessa laughed at the removal of my title. Now I was about to walk into the company whose sleek executive optics she had attached herself to and take the highest operating seat in the building. You can call that justice if you want. I call it sequence. I went upstairs, showered, pressed a charcoal suit, and reviewed the transition deck until 11:40 p.m. North Haven had 312 employees, 43 million in booked ARR that needed quality normalization, 3 material renewal risks inside the next 2 quarters, and a leadership team split into 3 categories: people who knew the business, people who sold the image of the business, and people who had learned to survive between the two without being noticed. My first obligation was not emotional satisfaction. It was identification. Who could build? Who could adapt? Who needed to leave? Vanessa, at that point, was still unclassified. Monday morning I drove myself. No driver. No dramatic arrival. Just a black Audi, a parking credential sent to my phone at 6:52 a.m., and enough coffee in my system to keep sentiment from wandering where it wasn't useful. North Haven's new office occupied the top floors of a tower on Olive Street with a lobby that smelled faintly of cedar and expensive HVAC. Their reception design team had gone for confidence by way of curated restraint, cream stone, bronze trim, art selected by someone who wanted abstraction to suggest intelligence without demanding that anyone feel anything in particular. The security desk had my name before I reached it. Good morning, Mr. Mercer. 3 words. Perfectly ordinary. Still, I noticed them. Because once you've been removed from one building, entry into another never feels entirely casual again. I took the express elevator to 44. Miriam was already there with 2 associates, North Haven's interim general counsel, and the departing CFO. Who looked like a man relieved to finally serve a version of reality he would not later have to apologize for under oath. We spent 92 minutes in transition review. Immediate cash controls. Customer communications. Sales comp redesign. All hands narrative. Founder departure language. Retention plan for critical engineering staff. Assessment cadence for senior leadership. It was exactly the kind of work I am built for. At 8:58, General Counsel slid a folder toward me containing my formal appointment documents, board resolutions, and interim authority memo. I signed where indicated. When I finished, Miriam said, "All right, Grant. Go meet your company. There are people who enjoy the theater of a takeover. I do not. But I would be lying if I said I felt nothing walking onto the main floor and seeing heads turn in real time as the internal announcement traveled faster than the prepared words designed to accompany it. Employees knew something had happened. They did not yet know the exact shape. Ryland's executive assistant stood near the corridor with the expression of someone who had spent 12 hours watching a future collapse and was now trying to determine whether the incoming regime would be cruel, indifferent, or competent. I gave her the only kind of reassurance I believe in. "Good morning," I said. "We'll need the conference center open 10 minutes early. And if anyone asks, nobody is in trouble for being surprised." Her shoulders dropped half an inch. Competence, delivered calmly, is often more comforting than kindness performed badly. The all-hands began at 9 o'clock. I won't pretend speeches don't matter. They do. But they matter less for their eloquence than for the ratio of truth to perfume. I told the room who I was. I told them what Ashford Vale had acquired and, more importantly, what we had not. We did not buy a set of slides, I said. We bought a business with real clients, real people, real product value, and real operational strain. My job is not to punish strain for existing. My job is to stop pretending it isn't there. That got their attention. So did the next part. There will be changes. Some fast. Some measured. None of them will be made for optics. If you know the work, if you tell the truth, if you care more about customer reality than executive mythology, we are going to get along just fine. If your primary skill is protecting fiction, this will be a longer week for you than for most. No one applauded. Good. Applause in moments like that usually means people heard a performance. What I wanted was recognition. After the all-hands came departmental introductions. Finance first. Customer success. Implementation. Enterprise sales. Then strategic partnerships and market development. Vanessa's division. I let the chief people officer walk me there, though I already knew the floor plan from diligence. Long corridor. 2 glass huddle rooms. Shared touchdown tables. Corner office at the far end with 1 wall of shelving not yet fully populated enough to look organically achieved. Her new office. The same office I'd heard about in careful third-party language for months. The office attached to the title she had used to recalibrate herself socially after mine disappeared. When I reached the doorway, the chief people officer said, "Would you like me to gather them in the team room?" "No," I said. "Let's do this where they work." The team was already standing. 7 people. Laptops open. Wariness active. Executive transitions have weather, this was thunderstorm weather. Vanessa stood near the end of the table in a slate blazer and ivory shell, one hand resting on the back of a chair. Her face, when she saw me in her doorway with the chief people officer half a step behind and the new CEO badge clipped to my jacket, did not change all at once. That would have been easier. It changed in stages. Recognition. Calculation. Disbelief. Then the private, involuntary understanding that the hierarchy in the room had just reorganized itself around a fact she could not charm out of existence. "Good morning," I said. No one moved. I looked at the team first, not Vanessa. Always the team first. "I'm Grant Mercer. As of this morning, I've been appointed CEO of North Haven. I'll keep this brief because I'd rather learn how this group actually works than deliver a speech in your department doorway." I rested one hand on the doorframe. "Here's what I need from this team over the next 10 business days. A clear map of active partner relationships, revenue influence versus claimed influence, channel pipeline quality by stage, and any commitments currently in flight that were sold externally before they were operationally real internally. I prefer embarrassing truth to elegant fiction. If that's how you work too, we'll do well together." Then I looked at Vanessa. Not dramatically. Simply because at some point reality has to complete the circuit. "Vanessa, I'd like 30 minutes with you at 11. Her lips parted. Then closed. "Of course," she said. And there it was. The woman who had laughed in my kitchen when my title disappeared was now scheduling time in her new office at my request because I had become the title above hers. I wish I could tell you the moment felt triumphant. That would make for a cleaner story. It felt stranger than triumph. More educational. Because what I saw in her face was not simply humiliation. It was recognition. Recognition that she had mistaken a temporary loss of platform for a permanent reduction in capacity. People do that all the time. They confuse interruption with diminishment. At 11 o'clock, Vanessa came to the conference room outside my temporary office carrying a legal pad she did not end up writing on. The door closed behind her. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I didn't know it was this deal." "I assumed you didn't." "When did you know?" "That North Haven was in play." "In stages." "That I'd be in this seat." "Last night." She sat down slowly. "This is unbelievable." "Not really. It's just a chain of decisions you weren't watching from my side." She flinched, very slightly. "Did Miriam put you here because of me?" "No. And if you think that's how firms like Ashford Vale allocate control, you still don't understand the rooms you wanted so badly to enter." That landed. Not because it was cruel. Because it was accurate. Vanessa folded her hands on the table. "Are you going to fire me?" I considered the question. Not for effect. Because it deserved a clean answer. "No," I said. "I'm going to evaluate whether your function is real at its current shape, whether your reporting is reliable, and whether your work survives contact with actual numbers. If it does, you stay. If it doesn't, you won't. Same as anyone else here." She held my gaze. "You really can do this without making it personal?" "Vanessa, the only person in our marriage who turned my professional instability into a personal performance was you. I have no intention of repeating your mistake in reverse." That was the first time she looked genuinely ashamed. Not socially cornered. Ashamed. A useful beginning. If all you wanted from this story was the moment I walked into Vanessa's office as her boss, technically you have it. But the truth is, title reversals are satisfying for about 12 minutes. After that, work starts. And work is where character stops being hypothetical. In my first 30 days at North Haven, I replaced the sales comp structure, froze 2 vanity hiring plans, cut 3 external agencies whose deliverables were 90% deck sheen and 10% utility. And built a weekly operating review that separated booked revenue from believable revenue in a way the previous regime had skillfully avoided. I also started individual assessments on every vice president and above. Not broad vibes. Evidence. Decision quality. Cross-functional credibility. Information ownership. Depth under pressure. Vanessa's assessment mattered because her department was one of the areas where North Haven's public image most obviously outran internal proof. The first week, I asked for a complete inventory of partnership relationships, channel contributions, event-originated pipeline claims, and executive-facing market positioning materials tied to actual customer outcomes. What came back was elegant. And insufficient. The decks were beautiful. The attribution logic was muddy. Terms like influenced revenue and strategic acceleration had been doing heroic labor in place of auditable evidence. Vanessa wasn't solely responsible for that culture, she'd inherited part of it. But she had adapted to it with far less resistance than someone with genuine executive gravity should have. So I called a deeper review. Vanessa arrived with her director of alliances, a senior analyst, and the composed expression of someone determined not to be interpreted as rattled. She had switched, I noticed, from her earlier high-gloss presentation style to something more restrained. Dark blazer. No flashy jewelry. Fewer decorative phrases in her open. That change wasn't for me personally. It was for the new operating environment. People adjust quickly when the room stops rewarding theater. We spent 90 minutes walking line by line through claims her team had been making for 2 quarters. This 32% figure, I said, tapping a slide, how much of this was sourced through partner channels versus touched by a partner after a lead already existed in another pipeline? Her analyst answered first. If we're being strict, actual sourced contribution is closer to 14. Vanessa closed her eyes for half a second. There it was. Not fraud. But inflation by euphemism. One of corporate America's favorite hobbies. Then change the language, I said. Immediately. If marketing wants to say we have ecosystem momentum, that's their department's mistake to clean up. This team is going to start using math. No one spoke. Then Vanessa said, quietly, understood. That meeting did more for my view of her than the private conversation had. Not because she was flawless. Because she stayed in the seat. Plenty of executives fold under that kind of scrutiny. They deflect. They weaponize emotion. They appeal to context until context becomes camouflage. Vanessa didn't. She took the hit, absorbed the correction, and came back the following week with revised reporting that was materially better. Painful truth, part of me respected her for that. Painful truth number 2, respect is not reconciliation. Outside work, the divorce moved toward finalization. Our house sold in September to a cardiologist and her husband for $310,000 over asking because Highland Park had decided scarcity was now a personality. We signed electronically within 20 minutes of each other. The platform showed her signature timestamped 6 minutes before mine. It struck me then how much of marriage and divorce now happen without paper ever changing hands in the same room. People can dismantle 7 years with Wi-Fi and tasteful fonts. One Friday evening after the sale, Vanessa asked if we could talk somewhere not attached to either council. I almost said no. Then I said yes, but in public. We met at a quiet bar inside the mansion on Turtle Creek at 6:30. Low lights. Good glassware. The kind of room where difficult conversations can pretend, for an hour, that they are taking place inside civilization rather than damage. Vanessa arrived 5 minutes late and looked tired in a way makeup can only partially negotiate with. Not ruined. Not tragic. Just tired. We ordered drinks neither of us really wanted. She went first. I owe you an apology, she said. I didn't rescue her by saying she didn't. People who need to say a true thing should be made to carry the weight of getting all the way through it. For the night you got fired, she continued. For laughing. For what I said after. For how long I had already been, somewhere else in my head before I admitted it. I watched her for a moment. Why now? A lot of people hear apology and think timing is rude to question. I think timing is part of the content. Vanessa looked down at her glass. Because seeing you at North Haven that morning made something embarrassingly obvious, she said. I had built this whole private story about you being static. Safe. Necessary, yes, but static. And when Sentinel happened, I thought it proved something about you that I had already started believing. Then 8 months later you walked in above everyone. Including me. And I realized I had confused your steadiness with limitation. There it was. Not love regained. Not a plea. Just a cleaner diagnosis than she'd been capable of before. You didn't just confuse it, I said. You mocked me for it. She nodded once. I know. In front of other people. I know. At the most vulnerable professional moment I'd had in over a decade. Her eyes met mine then, and for the first time since before the marriage ended, there was no presentation layer between the feeling and the face. I know, she said again, and this time the words sounded expensive to say. I believed her. Believing someone is sorry, however, does not obligate you to rebuild the house they burned warm first. Why did you really ask to meet? I said. She looked almost relieved that I asked directly. Because I don't know how to work for you without every room feeling like judgment. Interesting. Not because she wanted me back. Because she wanted the architecture clarified. Then let me make it simple, I said. At work, I'm not your ex-husband. I'm your CEO. That is either good news or bad news depending entirely on whether the substance of your job survives scrutiny. Personally, there is no hidden trial still happening. You don't need to win me over. That phase of my life is closed. She absorbed that without visibly flinching, which I respected. And if it doesn't survive scrutiny? Then you'll leave for the same reason anyone else would leave. Because the role required more truth than they could provide. A server passed behind us carrying old fashions to another table. Somewhere in the lobby, someone laughed at something that had not yet cost them enough. Vanessa twisted the stem of her glass once. Do you hate me? She asked. I thought about the question longer than she probably liked. No, I said. I hated what the laugh revealed. There's a difference. That answer landed in her differently than anger would have. Because hatred can be used to prove importance. Clarity cannot. At North Haven, the next 60 days clarified everything. Vanessa improved. Materially. Her reporting became tighter. Her meetings shorter. Her claims less ornamental. She stopped speaking in slogans when a number would do. She also discovered, perhaps for the first time in her career, that being close to power is not the same as being trusted by it. Trust is slower. Harder. And immune to tailoring. By October, her department had been restructured. Not because I was targeting her. Because the function genuinely needed it. Channel strategy was folded into enterprise revenue operations. Market positioning moved under a newly hired chief marketing officer with real analytics discipline. Vanessa's title compressed from senior vice president to vice president, strategic partnerships. Same pay for the remainder of the year. Less symbolic altitude. She accepted without protest. That told me she had, at minimum, begun understanding the difference between value and stage height. Around the same time, I received a call from Derek Linwood. Sentinel Crest's former CEO. He had been removed after a messy board dispute involving quarter-end disclosures, implementation failures, and the exact kind of optimistic self-fiction I had warned them about before they pushed me out. He wanted to know if I would consider an advisory call. I declined. Not because I was angry. Because some buildings don't get a second version of your competence after they spent the first one so cheaply. That night, after I hung up, I thought about Vanessa's laugh again. Not with pain this time. With distance. I realized the reason it had marked me so deeply wasn't only that it was cruel. It was that it had arrived at the exact moment when I most needed to know whether love in my life was tied to function, title, and visible force, or to something sturdier. Her answer had come quickly. Life, to its credit, had provided mine more slowly. Our divorce finalized on a Wednesday at 2:14 p.m. No courtroom drama. No final speech. Just two attorneys, a judge with a careful voice, a packet of signatures, and the legal confirmation that what had already ended emotionally was now over in the format institutions recognize. I walked out into bright Texas heat and felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with winning. People misunderstand closure. They think it feels triumphant. Usually it feels administrative. The real relief comes later, in the ordinary moments no longer bent around a distortion. Mine came the following Sunday when I drove to Dayton to see my parents. Dad was in the garage rebuilding a pressure regulator assembly for no urgent reason except that he likes mechanical things better after they've been opened up and understood. Mom had a roast in the oven by noon because in her world feeding people is still the first respectable response to upheaval. We ate in the same kitchen where I had once studied calculus at 16 and filled out financial aid forms at 17. The same kitchen where my father told me college mattered less than whether I became the sort of man whose word could hold weight in a bad quarter. After lunch, he and I sat on the back steps with coffee. He asked about North Haven. I told him the truth. The company was stabilizing. Renewal confidence was improving. 2 senior departures had turned out to be gifts disguised as inconvenience. The new CFO could read a balance sheet without using optimism as a hallucinogen. The engineering team, once insulated from executive theater, had started producing better once they realized someone upstairs finally cared what was actually true instead of what photographed well. Then he asked about Vanessa. I told him that truth too. She was still there. Working. Better than before. Smaller title. More substance. Less decoration in the language. I said I thought she had finally begun understanding that proximity to polish is not the same as earned weight. Dad nodded like a man hearing weather patterns confirmed. And you? He asked. What about me? Did you get meaner? That is exactly the sort of question my father asks. Not whether I healed. Whether I hardened in the wrong direction. I thought about it for a while before answering. No, I said finally. Cleaner, maybe. Less willing to confuse being needed with being valued. Less interested in being admired by people who mistake restraint for weakness. But not meaner. He sipped his coffee. Good, he said. Mean is lazy. Clean takes more work. I have carried that sentence with me ever since. Back in Dallas, North Haven's first quarter under the new structure came in lower on paper and healthier in reality. That is what corrections often look like when grown adults stop feeding a business the emotional diet of its previous leadership. Reported growth softened. Gross margin improved. Customer escalations dropped. Implementation timelines became less magical and more credible. Investors with short attention spans get nervous around those transitions. Serious operators do not. One afternoon in November, Vanessa stopped by my office after a leadership review. Not the old office that had once been hers. Mine. She was carrying a revised partnership framework and a leaner budget proposal that cut 2 unnecessary event series she herself had championed under Rylan. These should have been cut earlier, she said, setting the folder down. I was protecting visibility that didn't justify the spend. That was not a glamorous sentence. Which is one reason I knew she meant it. I reviewed the pages, then looked up. This is better, I said. She nodded. I know. A year earlier she would have needed more from that exchange. Validation. Softening. Some indication that improvement in one area reopened the human account in another. Now she simply took the professional acknowledgement and left. That, in its own way, was growth. Later that same week, Miriam and I were reviewing portfolio planning when she asked, with her usual lack of decorative tone, "Do you regret taking this assignment given the complication?" I knew who she meant. No, I said. Why not? Because it forced me to prove something to myself without ever needing to say the proof out loud. Miriam closed the file in front of her. Which was? I looked through the glass wall of my office at a floor full of people working inside a company that, 8 months earlier, had looked glossy enough to impress anyone too distant to inspect it properly. That losing a title and losing your value are not the same event, I said. She gave one short nod. That was all. The last meaningful conversation Vanessa and I had happened in December, almost a year to the week after the firing. There was a holiday reception in the lobby, soft jazz trio, rented trees, cautious cheerfulness. She found me near the elevators after most people had started drifting out. I used to think confidence looked loud, she said. I waited. I don't anymore. There was no request inside the sentence. No trap. Just an earned understanding arriving late. Most people learn that after it costs them something, I said. She smiled, but not happily. It cost me you. I considered the line, then answered as kindly as I could without lying. No. What cost you me was laughing when I was on the floor instead of kneeling there with me. The misunderstanding came earlier. The laugh was just when it became audible. Her eyes watered once. She blinked it back. That's fair, she said. Then she took the elevator down. I watched the numbers above the doors descend and felt nothing cinematic. No surge. No ache. No secret wish for a different ending. Just the quiet finality of understanding that some people are meant to remain in your story only long enough to teach you what kind of loyalty is real by showing you, decisively, what isn't. So if you want the moral of this, here it is. Do not panic when someone mistakes your calm for weakness. Do not rush to correct people whose respect depends on your current platform. And never, ever confuse the loss of one role with the collapse of your actual worth. Titles move. Markets turn. Buildings change the names on their doors. But if your value lives deeper than applause, deeper than optics, deeper than the easy confidence people borrow from borrowed status. Time has a habit of making the difference impossible to ignore. My wife laughed when I lost my job. 8 months later, I walked into her new office as her boss. That was satisfying. What mattered more was this. I walked in as the same man she had underestimated. Only now, the room knew it too.